You're listening to audio from the Village Church, a community that's formed by the gospel and sent on God's mission, gathering weekly in the heart of downtown Hamilton, Ohio. For more information about the Village or to connect with us, you can find us online at myvillagechurch.com.
Hey all, Michael here, one of the pastors of the Village Church. Thanks for listening today. Today we're looking at the Teaching Roundtable recap, and 2 weeks ago we talked about preparing a sermon, talk, discussion, conversation, group discussion, whatever. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. With me today is
Scott O'Donohoe. I'm one of the pastors of the Village.
And Kelly O'Donohoe, a Teaching Roundtable participant and note taker.
Your title changes every time. Note taker.
That is
I
good.
am the note taker.
Cool.
Oh yeah, and I have some questions. In Question Asker,
It's been a while since we've done this.
we talked about preparation and editing, and so I have some questions for you gentlemen to recap our conversation. First of all, why does a teacher need to prep? And that may sound like a dumb question to some of our listeners, but tell us, what is the alternative? Because not everyone preps their talk, right, or their sermon. So what is the alternative, and why would you guys say that a teacher needs to prepare?
I'll go, and I'll set up one thing I didn't really mention. For those of you who don't know, Teaching Roundtable is something that we started in January, basically once a month-ish. Took a little hiatus in the summer, but we just get together with people who teach, open the Bible, and try to bring it to life for predominantly for those in the life of the Village Church. And so there might be group leaders in there, or Kelly teaches Rooted regularly for the women. Scott and I preach, and Scott and Kelly also lead a group, and so there's lots of context, different types of people in the room. So we just create space to talk about that. So why does a teacher need to prep? For me, I just go to maybe two things primarily, because we get to value the Word, and we get to value people's time. And so as we value the Word, we get to get at it and figure out what's there and what's true and you know, what did it mean, all those things. But then in the way that we kind of piece together our talk or sermon or conversation or whatever, it is a value of people's time. And we've probably all been in rooms where people stood up and seemingly just like off the cuff said words, and there are very few people who can do that effectively. Mm-hmm. Most of the time it's pretty obvious. I think maybe recently was at a funeral where I was just like, what on earth is this guy talking about? It was clear that he was just up there like riffing on some things that might be true about dead people and maybe the Bible and whatever, and it's like, my goodness, this is a waste of time, and it wasn't not good for the people in the room. And so I'd say value the Word and value people's time. We do have a divine authority. The revelation is God's Word, and we do get to use our gifts that we get to grow in, like the rhetorical skills that God gives us to not just bring it to light, but to bring it to bear. And so it's worth a little effort to make it clear, to bring it to bear. The alternative to that is just some flippant, lazy talk that has something to do maybe with the Bible, and that's not okay.
Yeah, winging it.
Yeah, right.
That's like, honestly, that's the alternative, is winging it.
Yeah.
The Word is, like Scripture, is something that needs to be put into people, and so preparation is first and foremost for the teacher. Teachers aren't like preachers, teachers, whoever's kind of walking into a room to open up the Scriptures or help people understand them. Like, it's not something that's in them. They might have it memorized, they might know it or whatever, but like, it is something outside of us that we are sitting under. It's not something that we just assume that we know what it says. And so, like, part of the preparation is letting the Word be put into us first. Also, like, man, it's something that gets to be for us as well. Like, we get to enjoy what's there and know what's there and appreciate what's there before we just like kind of fling into other people, you know? Like, we should sit and make sure that like we actually are feasting on the Word before we invite other people to enjoy it. And so, we get to let that be put into us. We get to enjoy it. And then I think after we've done that, we get to then invite other people into enjoying that as well. And if we kind of skip those steps and we just say, I'm just going to give people something, like, and you spent no time, like your assumption is like, you know what's there already, you know what needs to be said, and that your thoughts off the top of your head are going to be in line with the scriptures or with truth, or maybe it is like to the guy officiating the funeral, maybe there's some true things that you're saying, but maybe it's not coming from the passage that you have open right now or whatever. And so, yeah, I just think there's a lot of there are a lot of assumptions that go into just assuming that you can wing it when you show up. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That reminds me of several months ago, and I have no idea what the topic was, but we talked about throwing handfuls of sand.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if you show up knowing you have some good things to say, you want people to catch what you're throwing at them too.
Yeah.
Which we'll get to in a little bit with editing. But in the meantime, the three of us around this table agree that teachers need to prepare. However, we also agree that teachers prepare differently, and not every teacher prepares the same way. So we asked people in the room on Sunday, or Michael asked people in the room on 2 Sundays ago how they prepared, kind of what that process looked like for them. And we heard from several people, different personalities, different teaching contexts. What were the commonalities we saw and how those different people prepared, and what would you guys even say should be the must-haves for every teacher in terms of their prep?
Mm-hmm. The first thing is studying, which is, at least when I think of preparation, that's usually what I'm thinking of as certainly the, writing is part of the editing is part of all that, but like I think of the study first and foremost as the preparation. And so like asking like, what did this mean to the original writer and the original hearers of the word? So that's just part of it, and that's digging into culture and context and words and all those things, and also like, what does it mean? And so that was a part of, I think, everyone that shared too, is like, okay, we got to know what it meant, and now we have to figure out what it means. And so how do we apply this? What does this actually mean for us today in terms of the way that we live our lives or what we believe or any of those things at all? So those two things for sure.
Yeah, same thing, Bible, and maybe some adding to some of the stuff that we had talked about on this podcast and in Roundtable up to this point, but we want to get it right, and so we want to get it what's there, and then eventually get it across. And really the process is that going from getting it right to getting it across, and that takes into account all kinds of things, contextual things, audience things, textual things, all maybe even timeliness and what's going on around us, all those things. But at the end of the day, you get from the Bible to the audience, and I probably already said it once, but like we want to get it, get it right and get it across. I guess I would just say that. And I think it was a little loose, but I think most people kind of sat in that, you know what I mean, and like in some way, shape, or form, but. Again, most of the people in that room are people who largely value the word and value not just the word for the word's sake, but application of the word as well. Some helpful consideration, one of the resources that I passed out on that Sunday was from Simeon Trust, and it was David Helm, who wrote the little expositional book on preaching through 9 marks, whatever. He put together a resource, and in that resource, he basically simplifies the process. I think these are good words, and so I just want to talk through them. Like exegesis, 1, theological reflection, 2, persuasion, 3, and I think Scott and I chatted. I love that he uses the word persuasion as like our aim, which is because it really is to persuade, and that's not to coerce or manipulate, but we are declaring truth so that people might behold the truth.
Yeah.
So like our job is to persuade, not to convince even, but it is to like move people to like a greater understanding of the fullness of God. So he takes it from text, first audience, gospel, current audience. And so you take those kind of 3 movements: exegesis, theological reflection, persuasion, and again, text, first audience, gospel, current audience. For me, the way that process shows up, or the way that prep shows up, is I think I can boil it down to 3 ways, like what I would call the dig, and that's like what's there, the frame, and that's how am I making sense of this, and then the writing, like just doing it. And so we can talk more about that if you want. But
Yeah.
I thought that was some helpful stuff. And it was cool to hear, even from like Doug, like he walked through his entire process. So it's pretty cool to hear just different people and how they process differently. So.
Yeah, it's a couple of things. Like, one, it's hard. I think that's like it's difficult.
Thanks for
it's like
saying
it's
that.
hard work, like
Laborious.
yeah. And everyone who's done it, I mean, who shared in the actual conversation, like talked about how the process is difficult, and maybe some are easier than others or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's laborious. Like it's really hard work. So like just because it's tough or hard work doesn't mean that you're bad at it.
But how many conversations have you and I had where I'm like, this is really hard. I can't do this, or this must mean I can't do this. That's not necessarily true. It should be hard to a degree. Hopefully it gets easier over time. But
yeah, I mean, I think that spills over into like what I think are must-haves in prep. One, like, well, another common thing is it ends. At some point, the preparation ends, and you're done. That's true for everyone.
that's
like,
literally on my list.
which is
You're done at some point.
helpful to remember. But I think a must-have is like working up to that. Three things. It's trusting in the text, trusting in the Spirit, and trusting in the process. So like, if you're working from the scriptures and you are sitting under them, you're trying to bring them to bear on people's lives, like, man, trust what's there. Trust the Bible, that what it says is what it says, and you can let it land on your folks. Trust the Spirit, that no matter how your prep is going, no matter whether or not you're totally satisfied with the polish or how clean it is or your frame or any of those things at all, man, just trust that the Spirit's going to do what He wants to do with your sermon, and trust the process, both like in preparation and in future further discipleship. So trust the prep that God has walked you through over, whether it's hours or days or weeks in advance of whatever it is that you're preparing to share. Trust that God has been part of that process, and that what you end up with is kind of where He wanted to bring you in that. But then also trust that, like, if you're leading a community group conversation or you're preaching a sermon or whatever, like, those are regular, repeated opportunities. And so, like, those are cumulative things over time. So you don't have to, like, nail it in every sermon and say all there is to say in every sermon or all there is to say in every group conversation. But you get to trust that, like, God is the one who is ultimately discipling His people. And so, man, what you say or don't say, wish you would have said differently or whatever, like, there's all the time before eternity to, like, for Him to reveal that to the people that you're talking to and remind them over and over and over again. You know what I mean? And so it's like not everything comes down to this one thing, which is really hard to remember when you're in the midst of, like, prepping for this thing that's a big deal and that you care a lot about. So, yeah.
You guys are cracking me up. Hold on. The two preachers at the table have organized their answers to this question into 3 points around the theme, you guys.
Sorry.
You are such nerds.
Sorry, not sorry. What was it? You said text, Spirit, process?
Yeah.
I mean, it's worth saying that if you are listening to this or you haven't spent much time doing this, and we'll get to, like, how prep changes over time or whatever, but the process piece, you probably don't have a process. If you've never done it, or you're like, hey, I'm teaching a class, like, in the fall, like, but you don't normally teach class in the spring or summer or winter or any other time ever, it might be worth, like, just taking some reps on your own and, like, looking at a focal text that's coming up for a sermon or just, like, just practicing as if you were going to, like, give a talk or a sermon or whatever, because really you can't. It's really difficult to, like, hear these words and apply them without doing this stuff. I think so.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It's good.
I think the question matters because I think David said this, or maybe multiple people said this in our time together. But we all have finite time, and so some people's time is more finite than others. Preachers who are preaching week after week after week, and you're doing this over and over. But even if you have months to prepare a talk, at some point your time is up. And so, and I know I still do this. Like, I can never get enough study in. I could study the entire time and keep studying. You just never know all of the things, and so my temptation every time is to want to just do a little more study. And there always comes a point in time I get to the very end and I'm like, oh, but if I just had more time, it would be so helpful if I understood this. but I don't have more time, and so I have to go write something. And so I think that's just helpful for any teacher to go in knowing there's multiple things that have to happen during your prep time, and you need to leave yourself space to do them. You can't let one thing take up the entire, or like, if you jump in, I think we talked that Sunday about jumping into writing without some of the study, and then you end up having to redo the whole thing. Or I think it's just helpful to know going in, what is the plan, and how do I allot myself time for all of these things? So I think it's a helpful question.
Sure.
We talked about the commonalities that people had amongst their preparation. What about how it differed, or how could prep differ based on the type of teaching you're doing and the audience that you have?
Yeah, I mean, maybe in the class, I think somebody brought up like the idea of having like a quick turnaround for like leading a group. Like somebody's leading a group on a Sunday night. How does that look? Like,
which the Latinas are about to do.
Right. And so if their text is the text that we just preached on Sunday morning, when you're leading a group on Sunday night, and it was interesting how Doug was like, I mean, he's been doing this a long time, and he's like, I mean, I think if I have what's there, and like, hear a sermon on it, know in advance the text, like, really. And he said, if you have 12 people, 15 people, you're only asking a few questions, and so like, clearly he's competent to handle the word, and kind of know where you want to go. And so for him, he's not like crafting. He might craft an arc, but he's probably not crafting like anything crazy in terms of like declaration. These things I know will come out of this conversation with these few questions. That doesn't mean that he's not intentional. It doesn't mean that he's not whatever. But that might look different than like, let's say Craig Clow, who was also leading a group, but he's also doing like systematic theology on Mondays and like digging.
A lot of depth there.
And that's just in group. And so like, I mean, I think you're going to spend more labor doing exhaustive study and a 40-minute monologue. Well, that's going to be a lot different if you're, preaching proper, what we would say like traditional sermon to a larger group or whatever, because you're the only one talking, and everything needs to make sense, and it needs to flow, and it needs versus, I mean, you're in a group, you're kicking stuff around, and you can know where you're going to go, and you can even craft some questions along the way to like, navigate on the fly. So
absolutely.
Gosh, on the flip side of that, as a person who likes to be in control, sometimes a monologue sounds so much easier than trying to prepare like some kind of direction that's going to be interactive, because you know where you're trying to go, but at least I feel the need to account for the different directions the women might take us in, or questions people might have, and I don't feel the pressure to have all of the answers, but I want to have some kind of an educated idea of how to respond, or where to send them, or when to cut things off. And so, man, it is a completely different type of prep when you're expecting people to talk back to you, because you almost have to, it feels at least like I have to have it's not shallow. Like you can't go as deep necessarily, but you have to go wider. Do you know what I'm trying to say with that?
I would say on the flip, as a preacher, I think not consciously, you're trying to tear down those objections that don't flow from that don't flow from real questions, but hypothetical. In the course of a sermon. And so like the only kind of thing that puts, at least in my own mind, puts more pressure on me to not be able to like navigate in a room. You can say, I don't know, like what do you guys think about that? And like interact with it and like, I think, but having to like in one line declare a truth about that makes it like,
and you have to anticipate the questions, but if you don't, and someone has, then you just don't have a chance to answer it. That's
It's like sending a big long text to like a giant group chat, and it just sits as read, and no one replies to it, no one says anything, and you're like, what are people thinking about this? So
are you guys saying that you want people to tell you after you preach what they're thinking?
No, that's not always true. I would encourage people to pray about it and sit with the Spirit and let them,
And that's what community group is for.
I encourage them to talk to their group.
That's right.
Go to community group and hash it out.
No, I think there's definitely...
Give them your compliments, guys. Tell them when they say something good.
Like there's a difference between a monologue and a dialogue. It's kind of what we're saying or whatever. And I think there's... like we'll hit on this more, talking about audience stuff for the next roundtable or whatever. But in terms of just asking like, hey, what if I'm going into an environment in which I'm the only one talking versus a group discussion or a class, or somewhere in between, like what can only occur here in this space that couldn't occur in some other environment. If I'm preaching, like I get to declare lots of things, which in a group setting, I'm probably not going to want to dominate the conversation the whole time and just say lots of stuff. Versus if I'm in a group conversation, what gets to happen only there is that I get to hear from other people. I get to give some ownership of exploring and discovering stuff and reflecting there. And so it's like it does shape the prep, and like for a monologue, I'm trying to draw people in to like see what's going on, really just kind of through my experience in some way. So like I have to kind of paint the picture for everyone to get on the bus with and follow me with and all that stuff, versus like in a conversation, I still have to know enough about how this personally relates to me in order to translate that into questions about how do I help people explore, and kind of how do they get to paint that picture out, for them a little bit. So it's like it requires both some reflection and some declaration. But I think in preaching, like especially with the way our sermons kind of shape out, I mean, we certainly invite folks to kind of reflect throughout, but by and large, we're declaring things when we preach throughout, and then we end on an invitation to respond, to reflect and repent and respond, versus I think in more dialogue situations, we're inviting people to reflect like as we go and respond to stuff as we go. And at least for me, like I want to end with declaration more than anything else. So having said all these things, and guys, we've talked about this and there's this and this, like I just want to send us out with, this reminder, this truth or whatever. And so in some ways, like it's not absolutely those things, but the monologue is more, I think, declaring lots of stuff and then invitation to reflect, to repent, respond. Whereas maybe in a dialogue, you're thinking more along the lines of how am I inviting reflection and response and that kind of stuff during, and then like sending out with maybe some more clear declarations in some way. Truth is all throughout those things, reflection is all throughout both of those things, but maybe there's a different emphasis there. So I don't know.
Sure.
I would add one thing. I don't know if this is the scope of the question, but like for preaching in particular, a book which we're jumping into this week, 2 Peter, by the third sermon in there, you're like, okay, context is like we know where we're at and like how we got here, and you're like sitting in the living rooms with those people, versus like a thematic sermon series, which is different. Or even if you were like giving a talk at like a conference or like that's really thematic. And so just like a mindfulness of like the context for journeying through a book, like you are sitting in the book, like in those particular verses. And if you've listened to any of these prior, like we value the word, and we think that really the roundtable is when you open the word, what do you say? But if it's thematic or it's topical, or even in some lesser forum where it's like, okay, then your content might drive a little bit more. Yeah. And so just being mindful of like, I know a friend who's like, oh, he had to like teach at a dad's and son retreat. Well, that might look different than like a Bible. And so like you're starting with different, you know what I'm saying? And so you're crafting content more than discovering content. So like those are just some things that might change, whatever.
That's good.
Yeah. So in any of these situations, how do you know, or when do you know if you've prepared well? What's the mark?
Say thunderous applause. I mean, honestly.
Thunderous applause.
No, I'm just kidding. I guess the question is before you say the words or after?
You can answer however you want. When do you know? How do you know? Do you ever know if you've prepared well? Is it based on how you feel when you're teaching? Is it based on the feedback you get after? Is it based on someone texting you later about the thing that you didn't necessarily care if they remembered and they missed the point of your sermon?
Yeah, all those things.
Is it when you show up to group and you realize no one's following your line of questioning? Not that I've been there multiple times.
I mean, I could hit on all of those. I think for me, like, honestly, having done what I do for a little while now, like, and I mean, Scott asks every single week, every single Sunday, before I preach, hey, how you feeling? And, I say, like, on purpose now, like, oh, fine. Like, I'm not going to be like, dude, I cannot wait. Or like, oh, gosh, I want to throw up. I'm calling in sick. But I know, like, kind of what I'm aiming at, I think, and putting all of the stuff that we've talked about and more together, and kind of the rubric of, like, man, what's effective. And so I think even without looking at a rubric myself, I know based on how prep went, how my week went, what my notes look like. And for me, like it really is a balance of like some markers for me are like, do I believe that this is accurate? Is it clear? Is the frame something that's like, okay, like, I could share it with you right now and you would understand it. But really the major miss for me that is like a big difference maker is like, do I have human elements in this, whether that's story or example or something that's like a little bit of a pause of just not just commentating on the text over and over again, but is it like, okay, is there an opportunity for me to be a human and for humanity to come out in the words that I'm saying or the persuasion that I'm aiming at? And is it transformative or is it just declarative? And so I think those are some of the things that when I feel after I preach and I step off the stage, for me it's like, oh, that felt okay because there was some humanity, and so we're like some swings of emotion during the sermon. People's facial expressions weren't just, like proverbial playing Candy Crush on the phone, but like there were some swings of emotions, and I mean like connection with people when you're saying like all those things, and it was true, and it pointed them to Jesus, and we leave like lifted up more than kicked in the, all those things, and so. But at this point, I mean, I have a rubric and I can say, 3 out of 5. But really, it's like intuitive at this point. I pretty much probably know how things are going to go, by and large, based on
Before
just doing
you
it.
start talking.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, for me, I think it's like, did I make much of Jesus? So like, was Jesus the big deal of the sermon? Like, if that happens and that's clear from my notes, that's clear when I'm preaching, that was the emphasis. Hey, that's a win. Did I illuminate the text? Did I make it clearer or did I make it muddier? That's like but if I made it clear and maybe brought the meaning out so that if someone were to go back and read the focal passage when they got home or in a week or in 2 weeks, they would see what I saw. Or if they were to look at my notes and then go look at like my points and then go look at the text, they would see where that's coming from in the text. Did I make the text clear?
How do you know if you made it clear?
How do I know if I made it clear? Because my points are directly pulled from the text in some way. Okay. So using the same words, using, like even statements, which you don't get in every focal passage. There's not these nice, clean little statements. Oh, he put that in there so I could use that for a sermon point, on my slide. Like, it's not there. But like, do my points, is the language that I'm using, or am I layering on top of that other Christianese or my own language or my own words or my own ideas on top of that? Which sometimes, like, there's context and there's stuff that, hey, what we think it means from the quote-unquote plain reading, like, it's a little bit different than we think. But by and large, am I making the text more clear or am I muddying it? And then, lastly, did I make it clear, like, why this matters? Like, I might make much of Jesus and I might, explain the text, but, like, why does this matter to the people in the room? Is it cultivating Christ-likeness, calling to repentance, comforting, the suffering, whatever it happens to be? Like, what's the good news that I'm bringing to bear that actually changes people's life? Now, those things are like when prep goes well, when I'm looking at my notes or when I'm like, reading through it in my head, and those things are clear. That's when it's going well. That doesn't mean that it's always going smoothly. Like, those are very different things. I could come out of a very difficult week of trying to write a sermon, but I would still say that prep went well in the sense that it ended up with something that pointed to those things, but it doesn't always mean that like the prep went smoothly. So if I'm able to like enter the week with a loose frame of where I'm going with the text, if I can have a draft done by Thursday night, if I can spend the weekend just kind of editing and not creating new stuff and then that's when it's gone smoothly. But I think that's different than prep going well. So
yeah, that makes sense. I think mine looks a lot different. I'm much less experienced than the two of you, and I do a very different kind of teaching. But I just think of like what I'm working on the morning of, because usually I'm teaching on a Monday night, and so what I'm doing during the day on Monday is usually indicative for me of whether or not I prepared well.
There you go. Yeah.
Because if I'm freaking out and I'm still literally finishing the thing or writing the thing, and I'm stressed about it, I did not prepare well because I probably studied too long and didn't start writing soon enough or whatever it is. But if I have something and I'm editing or tweaking, I'm always doing something with it, or I feel like I could go in and work with this, then I think I probably prepared well, and that just looks, which honestly is not always directly correlated to how the night goes. Sometimes I don't prepare well and it turns out okay. And sometimes I prepare great and no one has any idea where I'm trying to go. So that's a different month.
That's funny.
So prepared well. How about editing? So we kind of talked about this at the beginning. And again, like that's, I think, one of those things that you could easily leave out or forget to make space for. But what is editing in preparation for a sermon or a talk, and what role does it play? How do you know when you're done editing, or maybe when are you done editing? I think that was illuminating for me from our time together, something that Michael said. So
Yeah, I mean, I think most of us would say that we're never done editing a sermon.
when you step off the stage,
like,
maybe.
but even when we step off the stage, because even then, like, I think all three of us would say that when we are delivering whatever we're delivering, whether it's a reading class, a sermon, or like a group discussion or whatever, like whenever we're done, even if we have notes and me who manuscripts everything that I say, there are still things that like come out of my mouth and that I say that like weren't in my notes, and so I would consider that editing in some way, shape, or form. Like I'm adding to, changing what's there.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's true for all of us, is that it's not really done till you're done.
You're done.
That
was freeing for me to hear. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and that's okay. And I think there's, I think part of that's getting to let the Spirit have some play in there and prompting with who's in the room, or even worshiping and enjoying what we're preaching as we're preaching it. Might spur us to think about some things or whatever. And so, yeah, heavy prep on the front side doesn't eliminate the Spirit like from doing stuff. He's part of that, but there's also freedom to let him do stuff while we're doing it too.
I thought he only worked spontaneously.
Well, do I have a surprise for you? So in terms of like the role that it plays, for me personally, as someone who manuscripts, and it's 3 points and they all start with C, so I'm doing it again.
You clearly edited the notes of this podcast.
Cohesion, conciseness, and comprehensiveness. So like for me, as someone who manuscripts everything, like it's really easy for me to get kind of to miss the forest for the trees of like my points, and so I'm like spending lots of time fleshing out each point or subpoint or whatever, and sometimes I'll get to the end of writing like a full sermon, but I've spent so much time in the weeds of every point that like I go back and I read the whole thing and it's like, oh, there's like, what's the common thread? Like there's a common thread that's missing, or it feels like there's not a unifying theme. It's in my head, but it has not been transcribed to the page like I think it is. And so editing for me allows it's an opportunity for me to like make those threads clear, change some language, use the same words in some places to make that stuff come about more clearly. Conciseness, I clearly have no problem with words. Well, my problem is like too many of them. So I need to.
What was your thing about editing?
I have to edit down.
Right.
Yeah, like. And I find myself in editing sometimes I'm like, I want to clarify this or whatever here, and so I end up like editing up. And it's like no, I need to edit down and say things more concisely. I think I always, I want to make sure that I hit everything and explain everything to the T, and sometimes that actually makes things more muddy, and so I need to be concise, edit down. Michael tells me just to say it and move on, like you've said that to me before. And then the third thing is
because my wife's told me that before.
No,
just say it.
It's good words.
Okay, yeah, no, that's really true though. Like,
no, it's freeing.
You can say it and then move on.
It's freeing. The last thing is being comprehensive. Like it allows me, as I'm reading through the sermon again, like kind of as a whole. Am I missing? Is there like a kind of person in the audience that I've not paid attention to, or this might land, what I'm saying here, maybe this lands kind of harsh or whatever, when what's the good news that I'm bringing to that, or maybe there's a cultural thing, maybe there's something happening in the news or whatever that like wasn't there at the beginning of the week but now is there at the end of the week or whatever, and so I need to maybe this thing that I'm saying or the way I'm saying it lands differently. So like there's just like kind of that comprehensive, want to make sure I'm mindful of some of the voices in the room that maybe I missed the first time through. So, yeah, cohesion, conciseness, comprehensiveness.
Yeah. So I have two. Both start with C, but so it's
just means you guys are well prepared for this conversation.
It's
That's funny.
What role does editing play in preparation? Well, let me tease something out first. So I said I do a dig and then I frame and then I write. I mean, whatever, more to it, but So the dig is scribbles, what's there, scribbles all over. The frame is like getting handles on what's there. Universal truths, what was true for them, what's true for us. Letting the text dictate the frame of the sermon, like Scott said. You want like a main big idea, but also like points to be reflective of the text. And then at that point, I then put it into a Google Doc and then start writing. But there's scribbles all over in the frame. Some of that's already thought through. Many times I don't even go back. Sometimes I do, but I don't even go back and look at that dig. That probably has a lot of stuff in it. I might just skim over it, but I'm not looking at that. For me, at that point, the frame, once it gets on a document, is like I'm writing it. I have a trajectory of an intro that kind of evolves as I work through it, and that takes time. It's toil.
Yeah.
You can have even if it's just a cultural reference or movie quote or story, but to hone it down to get tight to your main idea, to the tangent, to your point, that takes work. And so even as I'm writing that intro, I'm editing line by line, all along the way to okay, I feel like that's pretty tight. I'll come back to it. Main idea, set up series, set up whatever, and then the way this unfolds is 3 points. Point one, so I put all that stuff, the big markers in a document, and then I just start filling it in, writing, thoughtful. And really, that probably should be in the intro and so editing all along the way. And sometimes it is just well, man, I just need to get through this, so I'll come back to that, fill in the gaps, whatever. And so all of that leads me to, let's say I have something right now, literally, what time is it? 2:00 on a Thursday. I have a sermon done. I have the notes slides made. It's uploaded in Planning Center. The sermon's done. That feels really good. It's not good, and I don't even know what's there yet because I've not read over it. So that's what I needed to do in the next 2 hours. I'll read over it, and then what I will find is man, it's somewhat redundant because I'm trying to tie each point into a unity, but I'm saying things too often. I know that's the truth. With this particular sermon, it's there's some redundancy, which can do what Scott's talking about, either cut or at least retuck something to where I'm saying I can say all of that in one chunk rather than saying it 3 times teased out. So that that's literally what editing will look like. But the reason why you're never done, or I'm never done editing until I walk off of the stage after preaching, is you're always striving for clarity. Sunday morning when I look over it, Saturday night when I look over it, it's just, man, am I saying this in the simplest terms that I can? And to be fair, all this is in an idealistic world. Scott's written sermons where he's not thinking, okay, I've got this thing done. Who am I leaving out? How can, that's pretty idealistic.
Sure.
I mean, you know what I'm saying? And so we don't want you to think that every time it's okay, it's Wednesday, I better hone this. No, sometimes it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So all that to say, you're fighting for simplicity, but for me, it's clarity. Do the things I'm saying, do they work? Do they make sense in a structured way? Can someone follow along? Can they see in the text what I'm saying? And all that, for me, the editing is about confidence. And I don't mean self-confidence. I mean, at the end of the day, what you're going to have to do is read words on a paper and say them in a way that looks really natural. Mm-hmm. But and I don't manuscript every single word, but I manuscript most of what I'm going to say. So you don't want to be up there reading. That's where editing and just being familiar is okay, I can pare that down. I don't have to write out this whole story when I can literally just tell you the story. For me, that's what it looks like. Mm-hmm. So I'm not reading a story that I could tell you more passionately if I just talk to you.
Absolutely.
So those are things that I'm working on so that when I'm up there, I can be me and I'm not freaking out about saying the words in a way that looks natural. I know it's there. I'm familiar with it. I can say it confidently and I can say it clearly.
That's good.
That's good. Our last question, unless you guys have anything else you want to talk about, is how has your individual prep changed over the years? You guys have both been doing this for several years, 10, 11. How long have we been doing this? 12. Well, you've been doing it longer, Michael, right? You preached to youth before that.
Is that what I did?
Did you? I don't know.
That's true.
So how has your individual prep changed over the years, and how do you hope for it to continue changing into the future? God willing.
Man, probably lots of ways. I think probably the biggest thing is efficiency. I know you both said, Kelly, you say all the time that you just want to chase everything down, and I just can't.
Right.
Week on, week out, I just can't chase every cultural connection, and so like the quicker that, and I'm not shortchanging it, by goodness. It probably takes me longer now to write a sermon than it did 10 years ago. I don't know why that is. But still, I would say efficiency in like getting more precisely what's true. All of the theological growth that I've received in the last decade makes for a more efficient process, but it also makes for a more robust process. So I want to get it right, probably in a way that 10 years ago that might not have been maybe the highest aim, but yeah, being familiar with lots of theological tensions and truths and knowing both sides of arguments all the way down to, like, that I just didn't have 10 years ago. Now I'm bringing all of that theological understanding in, and so that does make it more efficient. It gives me more confidence to say things that I know to be true, and it also gives me greater humility to say them with like a little bit of like understanding on how somebody could receive that differently. So but by and large, when I look at a text, I'm more quickly thinking, how does this show up 6 days from now? Really, I'm thinking that a whole lot quicker just because I have to. So efficiency, I would say, maybe.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah, I would say same for me. It's changed in efficiency, probably confidence or whatever too. Again, from a humble, like trusting the text and the Spirit and the prep, through all that stuff. But I mean, it used to, like, if I knew I was preaching, I would spend like the whole month before, like trying to get ready, get my head around stuff, and then still the week of, it was like very common for me to scrap whatever it is that I had put together for 3 weeks and change it all and start over like the week of. And I mean, lots of reasons for that, for sure. But it would like consume my weeks. I'd be really stressed out about it. Not clear-headed. I'd be probably a grumpy mess. And it was not good. Like I would get to the end of the week sometimes and like just want to be done with it, which is not a place, like that's not where I want to, that's not the posture of heart I want when I'm like preaching. And I don't think I've ever preached from a place of like just wanting to be done, but I don't want to get to the end of prep and like feel just exhausted and like in a bad way. From that, I want to anticipate what God might do with this, whatever it is. So but now now for me, if it's the week before, I'm doing my like cold read of the focal passage the week before, then doing some, doing my little scribbles and stuff on things, studying, going to my, kind of trusted commentaries, and then coming back and doing not a cold read, but a hot read on, okay, now that I know kind of maybe some other stuff, revisiting what's that look like, and then frame it. And so if I can do that the week prior to me preaching, then like that's really helpful for me coming into that week where I basically know Monday's shot for me, but Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, those 3 days, I'm trying to crank out, like actually write, and with a frame, not like feeling like it's a cage for me, but like, it's supposed to be helpful for me as I'm going through my week, and intro for 3 points and closing, trying to get a first draft by Thursday so I can edit over the weekend. Usually there's like an extra day in there, a Friday or a Saturday, that I have to, throw into my work week because I'm not done on Thursday. That's just how it usually goes. And that's worked okay. That's been that way for, I don't know, a few months or whatever. And so, man, I sleep. I sleep now. I drink water. I exercise like on the weeks that I'm preaching, which was not the case, even like just a couple years ago. Just lots of turmoil over that. And so I think it's healthy. So for me, what I hope changed is like did I just get to kind of consistently live in that for a little bit? So you feel like the change has come in the last, several months. So, and kind of a sidebar for like just thinking about group preparation, because now we've kind of talking about preaching and stuff. Like so I do like a little video, 10 minutes or so for group leaders every week, just kind of food for thought on, hey, here's some ways that maybe the focal passage like intersects with some stuff that you can talk about with your group, and so kind of giving some handles for that for me to do those little videos every week for group leaders, which helps me prep for that really is my group preparation or whatever. It's kind of walking through this stuff. And so it's, hey, what's the context that shapes the content? What's the content of the text that then might give shape to some questions that are there? What are some questions that like kind of mold us, shape us as disciples? Like, man, what is this calling us to believe, or how should we live, or how does the gospel free or empower us here? And then, man, what's the vision casted here, like for disciples who are shaped by Christ or identified in Jesus? So kind of casting some vision about, hey, this is who we get to be now, freed and empowered because of the gospel. So like, that's kind of some structure that I've given to just my group stuff here in literally the last month as I've been thinking about that stuff. So, yeah.
And groups haven't met in the last month, so it's pretty fresh.
It's pretty fresh. Yeah, it's pretty fresh. Yeah. I've been walking through that in through 2 Peter as we've been prepping for that series. So it's been good.
One funny thing, one thing that hasn't changed over the years is just going back to what we said. Like, it is really hard. It is really difficult. And my wife texted me an hour ago, "Hey, get that sermon done." Like, which is just funny because she's for me and she knows what long weekends and late Saturday nights and try as we might, you know what I mean? And like, just doesn't happen sometimes. And so she knows what that means for me to get that sermon done before I leave today, which is pretty cool. And do you guys mind if I kind of close out with a passage of scripture real quick?
Sure.
One that we've read before together, but kind of brings all that to bear. So we never want you to think that that this stuff is, even as we talk about it, and even as we say, yeah, like it's idealistic, but it's labor, but it's worth the labor. And so this is Paul in Colossians chapter 1. "Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I'm filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is, the church, of which I became a minister according to the stewardship from God that is given to me for you." And so Paul's talking about himself as an apostle, but also as one who just gets to bring like God's word to bear, which we all get to do, "to make the word of God fully known, the mystery hidden for ages and generations, but now revealed to his saints. To them God chose to make known how great among the Gentiles are the riches of the glory of the mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Him we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all wisdom, that we may present everyone mature in Christ. For this I toil, struggling with all his energy, that he powerfully works within me." I probably share that every time we talk about this, but it's just it's so meaningful to me on those times, like you described, Kelly, when you're like, I don't think I can do this. Mm-hmm. You're not alone if you're teaching the word and you come to a place where you say, I just don't know. And yet God continues to use broken, clumsy people who really do try diligently to make this word known, clear, and that Christ would be fully known and trusted and treasured, So.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. Thanks for sharing that. So, we are going to be back together in person third Sunday in September. I think that's the 19th. And we're going to talk next time about communicating effectively to your audience, whoever that might be. So, I'm excited to have that conversation with whoever's there. If you're listening to this, you've never been before to one of our teaching roundtables, you are more than welcome to join us. We'd love to have you. It's not like a closed group or anything like that. We'd love to have you come and join us for that time. So it's right after the gathering, so you can bring a lunch with you or a snack or something and just hang out with us. We'd love to have you. So thanks guys for listening, and we'll catch you next time.